movement in the developing world, which focused its queer tourism initiatives towards local and indigenous forms of queerness, calling on the Prime Minister here.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yep, yes to both.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, one. There's something we have to clear off on the get-go. We tell you that queer tourism is something that happens on either side of the debate, i.e. it's still going to happen on op. But then what the motion assumes for government to defend is that we have to assume that we have to take a specific form of this tourism, i.e. we have to look at the indigenous form of these queer of queer tourism in order for us to fly in this debate, and the opposition has to defend another converse of what it's going to look like. Meaning then that op cannot come in a debate that's saying that queer tourism is something that is bad, but it's something that they also have to defend on their side. As this is an actor motion, our burden on our side is to defend one, why is it in line with the LGBT movement in developing countries, and secondly, is that how it would benefit the LGBT movement and provide more safety nets for them in the long run. But then firstly, let's define what the situation looks like in developing countries. We tell you in developing countries, homosexuality is something that's still not accepted. It's still not the norm. It's still being outcasted out there. And why is this likely to be true? When firstly, these developing countries usually have colonial influences. The colonizers have imposed upon them a culture wherein this is something that's bad. It's being patriarchal is something that's entirely good. Additionally, they've also influenced us with their religions. Their religions are another additional thing that puts into the reinforcements of these very ideals per se. Usually, these religions are patriarchal, or perhaps they see these LGBT people as something that is something immoral or bad. Hence, they try these people, or perhaps hunt down these people in very worst cases at the end of the day. Meaning then, the social movements in these areas aren't able to capture the moderates. Why is this likely to be true? Because we tell you in the context of developing countries, we tell you that people are still suffering from poverty. They have more proximate issues they want to solve at the end of the day, i.e. they're poor, or perhaps there's still political strife in the countries. They aren't able to think about the movement or perhaps other social issues because they have things that are perhaps concerning more their lives. They have perhaps education for them that could guarantee them a job, or perhaps thinking of what to eat the next day. Wherein this proves to you that they really do not have a lot of traction systemically, and they do not have a lot of sway among the people on the ground. So this also translates then that it is hard to create queer tourism or initiatives on the ground. We tell you hotels in developing countries don't have much queer training, or perhaps state programs in tourism don't have these queer programs because it ain't a priority. When at best it will be tolerated, but nothing happens at the end of the day. So what is our model in this debate? When our model in this debate is quite simple. Is that we're going to provide something unique. When by providing something, the way we're pricing it is that we're going to provide a queer tourism with a historical and cultural angle. So what do these narrative initiatives usually look like? When as it is tourism, it is part of tourism to become a part of immersion in society. We have to note that these queer indigenous people are usually people who are secluded within their areas, i.e. they have the leeway to develop their own culture, meaning that the idea of homosexuality is something that's entirely foreign upon them, that they don't recognize these things. They have a homegrown, a natural culture that is probably devoid of these Western influences. Hence, they're able to develop these ideas that it's something that's normal, that homosexuality is normal, or perhaps we can have homosexual people within power, or perhaps we can in power, or perhaps feminism is something that's highly accepted at the end of the day. We tell you that our farm tourism is going to look like immersions wherein people or war tourists can live with these people, or perhaps live with these people for a certain number of time, like in a week per se. They interact with these people, eat with these people, and sleep with these people, or perhaps there have been museums, lectures that they can encounter all day. Wherein it's basically an environment where they can enjoy and understand the culture of these people on the ground, and understand perhaps the queer stories that these people have at the end of the day. We tell you, the cultural and historical angle guarantees you more space in state tourism programs and by companies in general. Why is this likely to be true? When firstly, tourism has usually accommodated cultural things or historical things. It's usually part of the programs. That's why they tour around the world to experience these historical things or these different types of cultures, Or secondly, organizational support such as UNESCO that fund cultural and heritage programs. We tell you that having these types of programs becomes far more palatable for states to include within their tourism programs, and far more palatable for tourists regardless of their sexual orientations, because they see the cultural and historical angle of these things that they want to experience on the ground day. Meaning then the people who opt into these aren't just people from the community. The people who opt into this are also people who want to experience the culture, the history of these things. Meaning that on our side, this is probably where we get more different kinds of people to participate in this type of tourism, and more kinds of people to be exposed to this type of culture. Meaning on our side, we have more reach. We have more people who are able to experience these stories. Who are able to experience these stories.
Hi, sorry. PM, you're muted. Sorry, I'll pause the timer right now.
Hello, hello. Oh my God. I'm so
Yeah, I
sorry.
think we got accidentally muted. No worries. My timer is 5.
Yeah, 5:10. All right. So 2 more minutes. All right. Restarting in 3, 2, 1. On to our argument, is where we're able to get a better queer tourism experience, because the very purpose of queer tourism experience is you want people to have a good experience, for them to be able to immerse in their queer stories, and perhaps contribute towards the queer movement in general. The queer movement in general. We tell you then that the idea that these things are something that's secluded, isolated, that they have their own cultures, meaning that these are unique stories that people can encounter, that want to encounter at the end of the day, that it's something unique that they want to travel into. So meaning we have more people getting on our side of the day. Meaning then, if we on our impact, it's like really quite simple. When firstly you are able to create a fairly good and unique experience for the people at the end of the day. This is where for queer people who want to opt in, you see them a culture where it's generally a safe space for them, wherein it's devoid of criticisms, not devoid of transphobia or whatnot, and you can see a culture that's homegrown within their countries, that they can feel safe. Additionally, there's also some idea of cultural preservation. By promoting these things and putting it into the limelight, we tell you that the state protects these cultures, these queer people who are the minorities, because state is obligated to protect cultural history at the day. But then lastly, what we're able to get on our side is that we're able to guarantee empowerment. How exactly? Empowerment is we're able to get this empowerment because we're able to gain a certain form of validation, our validation to the movement and support for them. How? In the form of artifacts, in the form of history, in the form of a culture that had a power structure that supports these queer people at the end of the day, and where it's something that's normative. Meaning that they have more bullets to argue this idea that this is something natural, to show the people that it is something that's not entirely bad. It's something that it is part of our inherent cultures, and whatever we have anti-homosexuality, it's something that is that's fairly foreign, that's fairly Western. So meaning then, how does it translate to the movement? When it translates to the movement because it allows more people to be more exposed to it, and more exposure meaning that more people are able to understand the movement. Hence, they're able more to side with the movement. Means that we are able to shift the Overton window and get more moderates on our side. And since it's just a numbers game, we're able to forward more positive energy. Additionally, given its historical and cultural angle, is that this is where we are able to get less backlash and more approval, because no one wants to shit on history, and if they shit on these things, it's gonna look bad, and that they're gonna bad for the people on the ground. It's very bad in social media because it's history. It's something that people love, and it's something that's hinged on people's identity.
Thank you very much for that speech, Prime Minister. I guess just a little reminder to everyone to be a little bit mindful of the time. That would be appreciated. Rest assured, after the 7 minute and 15 second mark, I won't be writing down what you guys are speaking. All right. With that out of the way, thank you again. PM calling on the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep.
Oh, wait, just a moment. Hello, sorry. Can I be heard this time?
Yep. It's a bit louder, so that's good.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Let me just set up my timer while I'm doing that. Hi, everyone. My name is Leo. Preferred pronouns are he/him. I'll take POIs through voice in between the segments of my speech. Just please try not to badger. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government thus far has been generic. They say that we need safe spaces and understanding, and that's in their entire claim. But this is already inherent in queer tourism itself, as what the info slide tries to say. But as PM tries to also tell us, this will exist in both sides. So I'm not entirely sure what they try to bring to the table. But before I proceed to the bulk of my responses and argumentation, I just want to clarify what's the natural counterfactual for opposition to defend in this debate, right? Because we think that the form of queer tourism that opposition has is that while we think that we do not focus on cultural minorities and their versions of their versions of queerness, we can still focus on unique forms of queerness within the country itself. This looks like, for example, Marina Summers, while she may not be a Babaylan, for example, but because she has a lot of like Filipino inspired like queerness and etc., we still think that we're able to market that in the very first place. But also secondly, and I want to point this out, right? I think that government thus far has been squirreling away, right? Because I don't think that tourism is simply just museums and whatever. We think that tourism in and of itself is a marketing strategy. What does this imply? It means that it must be advertised, it must be publicized, but more than that, a lot of the time the expression that you're trying to market needs to be reformed and manipulated in some way to garner public intuition at the end of the day. But before I proceed to my argumentations, I have two simple responses to the bulk of government bench. Firstly, they try to assert that things like, for example, cultural queer tourism will be included in state programs, for example, because hey, everybody loves history. Nobody will deny that. I think that this is simply not true. Because coming from what they've said, that queers are truly not accepted, then I still think that states still stick towards to that majority value, and I don't think that just because you include a bit of history in it, then it automatically becomes okay. We have women, for example, we have like gay people being masculine, but they're still oppressed even right now. But even if that was true, I think that tourism is profit heavy either way. So states will have an incentive to authorize it in both sides of the house. That's not a unique contribution from government. But also on their second argumentation on cultural preservation, I think that this is not true. Take note of what I framed earlier. If government wants to maximize the amount of foreigners and tourists to influx and opt into this sphere of tourism coming from government bench, I think that they have to culturally appropriate in some way to make it more palatable. But secondly, even if that was true, again, they said it themselves. Nobody wants to shit on history. I think that they will preserve like these cultural minorities either way. On to the argumentation from opposition that will win this debate. Firstly, we think that we garner better foreign marketing. The premise of this argumentation is very simple. We need to note that in both sides, they said it themselves, queer tourism will exist, right? But if that's the concession that both benches want to make, then it all boils down to how strategic we are with queer tourism. Another thing that I want to note is that tourism is inherently geared towards foreign individuals outside of the country that you have your tourist spots, for example. What does this look like? It looks like one, because they are the highest consumers of tourism. Take a look at Siargao, for example, or Boracay. But also, secondly, these are the natural benefactors of tourism, these foreign people, because they get to experience another culture, for example. Therefore, our claim here is that we're better able to tap into that foreign market and tourists, and that's how we become more strategic. The walkthrough here is simple. What is the mental calculus of overseas tourists in the very first place? We think that in the context of queer tourism, their primary goal is twofold. One, to find a safe space. PM correctly identified that their queer experience can relate to, but also two, experience a spectacle, right? Let me answer these two burdens, right? We think that when we pander to more standardized forms of queer expression, we think that we tap into their relatability, for example. I don't think that tourists will easily give up their money just to go to the Philippines or Indonesia or what have you for an experience that they might not relate to. Because Babaylans, Hijras are queer, but oftentimes it's all under some level of cultural influence, whereas the form of queerness associated in standardized expressions such as the ones in tourists, for example, is often tied towards their own individuality, that I was born this way, for example. But Two, if it's a spectacle that they want, I just want to
People,
note here,
IPOI.
ladies and gentlemen, that there will still be a unique and cultural flair after my first argument. Like same way, for example, Drag Race Philippines is still drag, but it's severely different. While Western drag queens focuses on the ballroom aesthetic, Filipino drag queens focus on sleekness, like Marina Summer. One person on Drag Queen Philippines even wore a noodle dress that is so like very Filipino, right? The spectacle is there. We just want to make it relatable. Given that the fact that all those preconditions have been fulfilled, it's more probable that more terrorists will come in opposition compared to government. But sure, POI.
People go on tours to experience some things different or want to see it for themselves. People don't go on tours because they want to see the same thing and again because it's relatable. They want to see something that's entirely unique to them.
That's why you should listen to my walkthrough, because I explained to you how we can make uniqueness relatable to them so that it's easier for them to subsume to. Next time, make a POI that matters. Why is it this important? This is an actor motion, right? What is the inherent interest of a queer movement in a developing country in the first place? I don't think that a movement is just a group of people as what government would want you to believe. They're a semi-formal organization with hierarchies and even initiatives, as the motion implies. This means that if they want to keep up an initiative, that initiative must have ROI. This is easily better under arbage when more tourists flock in and hand over their money. Secondly, if they want state approval, I think it's much better under arbage, because they take a note at our ROI and they're like, okay, let's have more of that money, because it's not like tourists are just there for the gay stuff. They still need accommodations, foods, clothes, etc., which will still help with the local economy. But onto my second argument very quickly, local and indigenous forms of queerness are principally mismatched in this debate. I want to note that in these countries, the local and indigenous forms of expressions are one among many, but are still not the face of queer expression. I don't know about you, but I don't see a Babaylan in the last Iligan City Pride March. Instead, it was other queers. This is an important point of setup, because I want to note that the LGBT movement still have stakeholders. But the walkthrough here is what happens to them. They get abandoned because their values don't get represented, their businesses don't get supported, and they is efficiently being backslided by their own country, by their own queer movement. What does this imply? I think at the heart of it is that it creates internal strife, and this makes it so that initiatives from this queer movement, who is the main actor of this debate, becomes so much more hard to subsume to. So if you want a better queer experience, side with up.
Thank you very much for that speech, Leader of Opposition. Calling on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, audible and visible.
All right, all right. Pairam nga nung debate keeper. Ay, sorry, boss. Oh, may phone ko. Hi, POI through raise hand. Teka lang. Puta, wait. Ayun. Yeah, okay. Kyle? Yeah, I'll take POI through. Raise hand nga. I'll start the speech in 3, 2, 1. Note, unique and relatable cannot coexist in the same sentence unless you're juxtaposing them, precisely because relatability implies the existence of similarity. It implies the existence of something that is culturally significant and something that's probably proximate to what you already experience. If opposition wants to run that people go here for pride marches, they go here to experience the drag races, for example, they have to prove why this is different enough at the point in which people will want to go here specifically for this. Because what I would posit happens in opposition is that people do go, yes, but they only do so precisely because it's close to Palawan. They can go to the beach after. Few responses then. I think the bulk of opposition responses is to simply symmetrize the benefits, but the benefits, I'll prove why this is insufficient precisely because the experience that you're able to create under opposition is something that is subpar and is something that is not that different from the way that people already live their lives to begin with. It's not that different from their day day-to-day lives. But the second is just, do you want to tap into the overseas market to begin with? I think they don't prove why people are able to uniquely go here and are able to be uniquely convinced precisely because of this way, right? Because what I would posit is that people would already want to experience these types of places anyway, precisely because it's exotic. It's in the Asia, for example, like white people eat this shit up. The difference is that the tipping point has to be what you advertise in queer like tourism, for example. That is the main interest that you have as the queer like the LGBTQ movement. You want people to go here specifically for what you plan. This is where I prove where it's insufficient already, to the point at which that opposition will be unable to like garner people to go here specifically, precisely because the allure only exists within the indigenous like groups that you're able to forward on their government. Note, why is this the best avenue? There are two criteria on the info slide. The first is just how welcoming it is of LGBTQ. But the second is just how you offer unique cultural and social experiences relevant to the community. Note, Vince already proves the first issue, why this is the most welcoming. Even if you don't believe his analysis on why general society is going to be hostile / not care about you, you still have to believe that it's safer because of the structural reasons on how the ideas that are typically anti-LGBT came from like colonials, for example, through like religion or like through popular rhetoric from like white people, for example, things that have not permeated these types of spaces to begin with, but also that queerness is seen as something that is normal within these indigenous groups specifically. So in extent, it's far more safer on government for in these types of spaces. But why do we win the second criteria? This is the DPM extension. Note, the alternative that opposition has is cooked. It's whack. Note, there is not a lot of history for LGBTQ in greater society that you're able to forward, because any former ideas that you had in these places prior to being colonialized, prior to the ideas that LGBTQ is bad and terrible, entering that type of society has already been wiped out through things like colonialism. It's already been replaced by like religion, for example, which is why the popular narrative within greater society is that to see these types of relationships and type of gender identities as something that is abnormal. You have to concede that this is not popular in these types of scenarios, right? At best, I think what you're likely able to have is like more recent discoveries, for example. So probably art galleries that display art by queer artists, specifically drag shows, pride marches, etc. Something that are already borrowed from Western society, for example, because this is where these ideas have originated from. Note, this is just because there's less time for the culture to establish in these types of places. It's still likely to be in the baby stages, precisely because it's already unpopular within greater society to begin with. A lot of these things have only started to get accepted and to get like solidified in these places, something in very recent history. So what I would argue is there's not a lot of unique history that you're able to provide, precisely because it's something that is still recent and still something that is fresh within the memory of people. Before I proceed, I'll take POI.
I don't see their harm when it's in its baby stages, because I say it's important for us to raise the baby stages to a higher development.
So there's no way that you can't do that under government as well, precisely because like you could still develop it later, you could still do it when it's already developed. But brother, the problem is that your tourism is boring. It's something that's already existing in America, for example, something that's already existing in their hometown. You have to be different. You cannot be unique and relatable at the same time. You already lose on that. Impact then, although it's socially relevant, what you're able to provide to tourists specifically in this strategy that you have in opposition is something that already is contemporary, something that people are already able to experience in a more proximate level. They won't go here for pride marches, specifically because there's pride marches at home. Note, there's not a strong community also that identifies in these concentrated areas, for example. People are often scattered. Like often you have to live with, like often the way that you experience this, for example, is still through the big cities, for example, something that you won't be able to fully immerse yourself into that this for queer tourism. I think it's likely just going to resemble general tourism to begin with. Not only is there a small history then, there's also no concentrated communities in the opportunities and the tourism that you're able to provide in opposition, precisely because you're not different enough to for the tourists to immerse themselves into your culture. Why is this terrible? Firstly, the experiences that you're able to provide for the tourists are often things that are already able to perceive in other avenues more proximate to them. They won't go here for pride marches because they have pride marches at home. The important figures are probably still alive. For example, the great works that you're able to display, for example, are probably accessible online. Note, the culture that tourists will immerse themselves into are those that still resemble their day-to-day lives. Even if they're able to go to museums in Manila, for example, they'll still have to wake up in the middle of Cubao. Note, the experiences that you're able to provide is not unique enough to convince people to go here specifically. Why is this better in government? Firstly, the history is long. It dates back to pre-colonial, for example. There's limited records of it, so the only way for you to experience it is through going to these places specifically. But note, this is even more important because people have an allure for the indigenous. They have an allure for the history, for example. This is why people go to see the pyramids, for example. They don't want to see a cool triangle. They want to see a cool triangle that was built in the BC, before Christ. Note, the proximity as well. The secluded area where they can offer you great immense in this culture. For example, you can immerse yourself more deeply in a more exclusive manner. You don't have to wake up in the middle of a hotel in Cubao. You wake up within these communities that experience their day-to-day lives that directly incorporate the type of queerness, for example, that is inaccessible in other ways. Note that it's unique, that you cannot experience it anywhere else. That is why this is the best, tourist plan that you're able to create. If you want to be unique, you cannot be relatable. Opposition has to bite this.
Thanks very much for that speech, Deputy Prime Minister, calling on the Deputy Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
All right. Am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Okay, just give me a few seconds to arrange my notes and time. Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Dev. Pronouns he, him, POIs preferably around the 5th minute. Just don't badger. Through voice. Yeah. Starting my speech. Starting my speech in 3. There is only one Marina Summers, and yet every LGBTQ in the international drag scene still finds them relatable. Take that. She can be unique and relatable at the same time. The one thing that government tries to posit is that they try to guarantee empowerment and acceptance through exposure. But we question the quality of this acceptance given the presentation of what they have. Because when they say that indigenous queerness is more palatable, this is inherently untrue because it doesn't cater to the internationals who don't even know they exist in the first place, nor does it align with the anti-LGBT values of the conservative countries we exist in the first place, nor do they relate to the majority of queers who can't relate to these cultures in the first place. Likewise, it stands to reason that states are also unlikely to create laws and support for these indigenous queers insofar as it harms the conservative narrative. Notice the context of developing country. But even if it's true that palatability can occur, using their own characterization against them and engaging in their best case, if they're trying to push for the indigenous model of queerness, then it will send a signaling effect that this is now the new standard of what it means to be queer. This has impacts. One, businesses and hotels, for example, that do change for their side, only accommodate these indigenous queer presenting queers and still actively disenfranchise the majority of queers that you fail to represent. Secondly, the laws and policies you do get on their side will also revolve around protecting these indigenous queers and not the queers as a whole. This is inherent reversal. This is an inherent reversal of the LGBTQ movement this motion is about and always has fought for. It already opposes the actor motion at hand. This tells you that government operates on the biggest benefit is actually a harm. The second thing I want to tell you is that familiarity is still important. Firstly, international tourists are not all adventure-hungry people. They're not homogeneous. Each individual has a unique threshold of comfortability they're willing to take. Creating that experience of familiarity maximizes the amount of people who opt in, because not everyone is gonna jump off of top of a plane just because it's unique, but more people can appreciate that this different country is willing to accommodate them. But more importantly, familiarity is the avenue by which we reconcile our primary stakeholders with the international community. This is more proximate to us because there are literally people in our country who depend on us for our protection and narrative disbursement, and it co-opts the benefit that happens on government. They can't engage on this. But the first and most important extension I'm gonna tell you is that using indigenous people for enterprise and tourism is an act of exploitation for 3 levels. Firstly, you reduce their experiences to a pamphlet or keychain. Secondly, you force them into a box where they're only accepted if they're appealing or entertaining enough. And thirdly, you take away their autonomy because the endorser of their image becomes the arbiter of their image. The first level, a culture cannot fit into a single piece of paper or keychain, for example. Later, when you endorse these cultures, you actively package their traditions as attractions to behold by others like animals in a zoo. This is paralleled, for example, by how Caucasian Americans treat the culture of Native Americans. This leads to two things. One, it's much easier to misrepresent these indigenous cultures on their side for the sake of simplification and entertainment, because you need to maximize the income you get, and tourism cannot accommodate the complex history for that purpose, i.e. hiding controversies, for example. But secondly, we question, if empowerment is what you're looking for, why does it have to be tourism, which is inherently profit-oriented? We question this. But thirdly, the capacity for people to care is limited because they're only shown a side that can sell, that's good enough to be unique. This tells you that the quality of representation on their side is incredibly hampered and one-sided, completely tokenistic. But secondly, say that it does trickle down benefits for these indigenous communities in terms of economics and attention, right? This subsumes the culture of the indigenous tribes to a caricature of their image, such that they are now beholden to a standard that they did not choose, and they cannot change nor challenge because they don't have that power. They have to continue to appeal and to perform in order to continue the benefits. So you trap them into this state of performance. This highlights the questionable positioning of tourism because it contradicts the very principles of the LGBTQ movement and incites them with harsh criticism. I don't understand why the movement would want to inflict this upon themselves. It also invites a distorted or fetishized version of queerness to people outside of the movement, thus further warping the image we've tried for so long to build, and gives a burden to their members that they did not consent to. This proves that the indigenous tourism disproportionately affects the reach you achieve, while at the same time harming the very actors we're trying to protect. Let's widen the margin even further. You take away their autonomy to choose their own image because government concedes that they want to maximize the benefits that tourism brings. That implies that the standard these indigenous people have now are now dictated by tourism itself and not by their individual cultures that they try to proceed to. And LGBTQ is now guided by economic advantage. This is the worst way of advancing queer rights because the principle of the movement is not money, it's liberty. Government says exposure equals understanding. But we posit that the tipping point is the quality of that exposure. It's what dictates that impact. It's the quality of presentation. Just because you have more eyes on you doesn't mean it's automatically good. This exposes the inherent contradiction in government's case, which harms queers in these countries as a whole. POI, yes.
If the mechanism to exploitation is to say that you want its profiteering, therefore it's exploitation, this can also apply to opposition. If the way that you prevent that is to say that the movement will do it well, I think that's inexclusive.
You weren't listening. I said this is exploitation because you remove their autonomy and you make them a product. The comparative is simple on opposition because we're not just espousing an indigenous product as a marketing team, we're espousing the values of the international LGBTQ standards as a whole, which covers more people as a whole. This is better, and because it doesn't harm anyone directly, steal anyone's culture, it just creates a more diverse set of a more diverse exposure for the existing queer culture we already have. On this second comparative then, on how it achieves the goals of the movement. One, it protects the most proximate actors. It shows our supporters that we're still capable of catering to their needs. But two, it reconciles both our local members, for example, or even these indigenous queers, because benefits trickle down for their rights, for example, with those of the international standards. We have already been successful enough to create a trend that creates freedom for all. The question then, the extent on benefit, because government is banking on uniqueness alone, but it's obvious that they don't understand queer culture, whereas on opposition, you have the local advancement, the international attraction, the proximity to the incentives of the movement itself, and the greater scale and spectrum of impact thus is maximized on opposition. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech, Deputy Leader of Opposition, calling on the government with here.
Hello, I hope I'm loud and clear. What?
Hi. Hello. Just try speaking up a little bit. It's a little bit quiet on my end.
Hello.
Yeah, that is much better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just set up a timer. Okay. Hi, my name is Kai, POI Boy. It's pronounced here. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to first clarify that we don't go to tourist spots and icons just to see a common accessible fragment. This debate won't exist if that is the case, because what we have to talk about is how queer tourism really works. Because what we promote on our side are narratives that promote the local stories of queerness. Also, these stories tell people that queerness has been going on for years, even absent the influence of Western ideas. Now, let us talk about the goal of queer tourism in the first place. This is not only specific for people to relate to whatever icon they're seeing. What this does to the people who are visiting or are seeing is to make them feel some kind of connection. And I think for them to enjoy that type of connection is the most important in this debate. I want to first respond to what their DLO said. I want to say that exploitation is not an issue in this debate, because on their side of the house, you also exploit them on your side, because we have to agree that we're talking about queer tourism. You said it yourself that queer tourism is something that is marketable. You also sell them on your side, because if you don't sell them, then that means that that is much worse on your side, because that would imply that you display and flaunt them for free. That means exploitation is much worse on your side, because if you don't sell them, then they're not being paid, which is just slavery. They even lose in this issue that they bring out. The moment you attach the word queer with tourism, you have to accept that you have to engage with the market. We clarified from our first speaker that on both sides, queer tourism happens. So I don't know why they throw out this exploitation and still at the end of the day, they lost this issue. Next, I want to talk about and bring back what we expect in tourism. We allow people to learn with artifacts or places. There is also something to take away that is expected. That this is precisely why people go far away from their natural environment just to experience tourism, because this also affects the non-members of the community that these particular tourism targets, in a way that since we are touching on local and indigenous culture, the retaliation that may come from conservatives are much toned down. This is what my first speaker has argued. This is true. Insofar as one, local culture is respected by the people, the history is preserved, right? The cultural value of these things that have been established such that the locals themselves can't go even against these local narratives and artifacts. We know that Babaylans are respected and they hold the same value up to this day. This is a reflection as to how the cultural value is always stronger than what persists in the status quo. This is backed up by the national desire to form an identity, especially in the developing countries that have histories with being colonized. This is why our frame still stands. Because Op replied to this by saying that the LGBTQ plus movement are being oppressed in the status quo. So it is untrue that history won't be judged as well, that they're not going to be accepted. Then they proceeded to just cite as well in the same breath that, oh, this is how history is something people cannot cheat on, just to conveniently reply to the preservation of culture. This is very confusing because they just told you that, okay, history is not something that people will judge. Also, this tell us that, okay, history is nonsense because people are still not going to be accepting. Note that we accept the fact that, okay, Babaylans are not there just to be with the LGBTQ plus community during Pride March. What we want is for them to feel some kind of connection, know their roots, know the history, because with that they find proof that they are being queer has been long existing. Because at the end of the day, our frame still stands. The developing countries offer history and cultural preservation. This is what they can offer. Note that we are in the nuance of developing nations, because if we are in America, then perhaps drag race is already enough. But what these developing countries can offer are their history and cultural preservation, as they arise from colonization or globalization factors. Thus, the strong desire to localize and promote what is indigenous is what remains and what should be credited in this debate. Now, I want to talk about their counterfactual, because they told you that, okay, not cultural minorities are but we want to promote unique forms of queerness that are relatable. Note that this is so vague because they haven't cited any other form of the tourism. They have, aside from Marina Summers, they haven't even built their counterfactual properly, because unique forms of queerness that they're talking about on their side is very vague. So up until my speech, there is still the question that lingers about what their true counterfactual is, aside from Marina Summers and Drag Race mentions. Note that they haven't provided you what this really looks like. It's only on our side that we prove to you what these farms look like, what they provide to you, because what they told you on their side is, okay, we are unique and it is okay for people to do this. And at the same time, okay, they are relatable. The deputy already told you that these two words cannot exist in the same sentence, because that is just nonsense. We win on that metric because,
Wow.
hello, you can access Marina Summers on the internet. You can find these icons everywhere. If our goal is tourism, you want people to access the inaccessible. That is why you want people to access your history, your icons, to make your history known, to make your culture known. Okay, if the goals of this debate is to find a safe space and enjoy a spectacle, as they said, we argue to you that we win on these things. Because if there, I'll take that later. If their problem on our case is that people won't relate with, for
Please take
example,
the POI.
okay, I'll take that.
If your problem is that people go to another country for purely uniqueness, America has beaches, but why do Americans still go to Siargao?
Excuse me, because Americans don't have the culture. They are the colonizers. They are not the developing countries. What we have, what these developing countries have, our culture, our history. This is something that you cannot see in America or in Europe, because they have been the ones who are stealing the history of people. That answers your case. This is why the nuance on the developing countries is very important. Now, I want to continue on the problem, on their problem on their case, because they said that, okay, people won't even relate with Babaylans and these local artifacts. Note that relatability is not the only thing that empowers the community. We also never told you that our goal is for people to feel related with the figures we are marketing. What we want to achieve is for the tourists to feel that even way back before, there's been a history of queerness. They have to enjoy their history, and what this provides is authenticity and support. This already makes them empowered at the end of the day. Because look, in the status quo, they have means of empowerment. What the history provides, what local culture provides, is a unique experience that you cannot just get from Marina Summers or Drag Race, because that is something that is cannot be touched by whatever influence we have in the present. Thank you.
Nice.
Baka nakamute.
Thank you very much for that speech, Government Whip. Calling on Opposition Whip. Here.
Hi, my name is JV. If I knew this was gonna get recorded, like maybe a day before, I would address something better, whatever. Pronouns he, him, POIs anytime. I might call out for one at 5, but you can raise anytime. I'd also appreciate if you put timestamps in the chat. Just first, sixth, then seventh. Thanks. Representation is only achievable when we come to an understanding that developing countries don't need a nudge. They need a push and proper re-education on what it means to have an identity and that queer people are people too. This comes in the form of not just accepting that queer people exist in your culture, but that they exist outside it not as strangers and lunatics, but as the same as you and me. The problem in this debate isn't that queer tourism is necessarily bad, nor is it that indigenous representations of queerness are bad, but rather why queer tourism evolves to become bad when it's geared towards exploitation under the facade of an inclusive adventure in fear that we won't be accepted by people despite the efforts of the movement to gain legislation and normalcy in the developing country, or in fear that our tourism is too boring for queer people and queer tourists. When isolation and fear becomes the model that your own members within these developing countries are feeling, instead of the empowerment and freedom that you champion, you yourself have failed to protect those that look up to the principles that you yourself champion. I have 3 pathways to victory for opposition, 2 of which dismantles the case of government and proves that this isn't a step to the right direction for the movement, and the last one widens the margin between gov and up. Proud to propose. The first one is on where the LGBTQ movement is better off, right? The first thing that Gov pushes is that the movement is better off when we push for eventual acceptance to the indigenous representations of queerness in developing countries. That is to say that they only push for recommendations and tours that are geared around areas where these cultural minorities live because of the assumption that it allows them to absorb the culture of the country while also not being afraid of just being tolerated by institutions within metropolitan cities. When they say that the movement can only embody its principles through isolationism and selective tourism, the problem with this is that it is the exact opposite of what the movement actually wants and what it actually is. The principles of the movement isn't just in the safety of their members and the general acceptance of the state. The principles of the movement are geared towards the empowerment of their members and the celebration of their identity regardless of where they are. This means that it's more than just the external validation from society to individual, but rather the internal validation that these queer people feel when they enter another land. The reason why this is important is because twofold, right? Because firstly, the push on government forces tourists to cherry pick where they can go, and they're unable to fully experience the country and experience some things different. Sure, on Gov you have unique experiences, but those experiences are theatrically planned and makes them lose out on the freedom of experiencing what it truly means to live and be a citizen of the country. The reason why this is important is because Gov proudly waves its banner of changing the country and making a unique experience, but is too afraid to show the good and bad of the country itself. But secondarily, because it signals to queer members of the developing country that a movement that they looked up to and felt solace in falling back on is only entering their country not to have a lived experience of the state of queer acceptance of the country, but only through experiencing indigenous queer culture that are already largely accepted in the country in the first place. But let me preempt the reply, right? People don't go to another country to have lived experiences. They go for the hashtag culture. But culture can be learned in the museums and queer art exhibits in Diliman. Culture can still be learned in the smiles on the faces of children playing patintero in their barangays. And their culture is largely integrated and nuanced even in the face of colonization. Because if Gov wants to push that our tourism is boring because we're not parading something that nobody knows, we say that the fun that people get in tourism is entirely dependent on the type of tourism that they want to experience and on the experience of the person of that country. Sure, You in government may be sick and tired of Cubao Expo girls and drag shows in the Philippines, but tourists aren't. The claim that they try to push is on the preservation of history, and that's the next thing. The state would want to preserve it because it's profitable and put into the limelight. They also say that we get more exposure, but that's a contradiction because it's difficult to buy into Gov's model. You get their shopping list of benefits from the state's eventual acceptance because of the number of people that choose to opt into their career tourism, but in the same breath, they also say that these cultures are well preserved because they're isolated from general society. They even try to push that it's worse on our side because IPs are no better than slaves because they're not getting paid. Oh no, I'm sharing my culture for free? Why is that so bad? They get paid by letting their culture live on, and they still get paid because of course no one is just going to go there for a night without buying a meal or clothing or local produce. But I'd like to flip this, right? We say that the difference between Gov and Op is the ability to consent. Under Op, if we market ourselves and the queerness that is general and boring under government, it's fine because we've wanted this representation for so long in the very first place. But if IPs get exploited on their side, there's an unfair power dynamic. They can't say no because they become strangers in their own lands, invaded by foreigners that are inclined to accommodate. It's marginally better on Op, even in just the movement level, not just tourism. Secondly, then, on the extent of change, what's the delta that happens on both sides and why is Op comparatively better? On Gov, the change they have is largely assertive. It depends on a string of good things happening and is entirely dependent on the success that queer tourism gets in these developing countries. But here's the kicker. Even if they do get these benefits, that fate aligns and queer tourism booms and causes it to show up in the radar of the state, what happens? They show up under the radar of the state for all the wrong reasons. Inserting more businesses, for example, capitalize on the guise of being inclusive to queer people. The state creates blanket policies that give the queer
Right.
community in the locality only base level rights that don't go against their conservative values. The only benefit that you get is the benefit of tolerance and feigned acceptance. Before that, any POIs?
Do you know the contradiction in their case that they're arguing for queer tourism, but they don't build any of it. But then they do proceed to tear down tourism as well. Do you know that the harms that they posit are inherent to tourism?
We're not against tourism. Perfect segue. The comparative under Op is that the experience the queer tourism that we have right now, one that does not push them into cultural minorities and indigenous representations of queerness. This still gets them into inclusive hotels, by the way, because that's the goal of queer tourism in the first place. Read the info slide. They're still given recommendations to restaurants and historical spots that show the revolutionary areas wherein the queer movement rose in countries like the Philippines. They're shown where the UP Babaylans marched to protest for rights for queer people. They're shown where the first Pride March happened in the Philippines. Sure, they're exposed to greater danger, and this is me engaging with our very worst case, by the way, because I want to get an 80, but at the end of that discomfort is eventual change. If queer people are being sneered at and discriminated during their tour, the movement's outrage will push for accountability. If queer tourism slows down in these countries, states get the signaling effect that something is wrong, they have to do something. And while that's all happening, we're not going against our own principles. We don't bow down to the state, and we still push for the kind of rights that we already enjoy in progressive countries. What makes this debate winning is the fact that regardless of success or failure, and this outcome independent, we still get people to experience our culture and we still get some level of change. We penetrate the country's bigoted ideologies and demystifies the idea of queer people to moderates through exposure. They see that we are people too, they see that we aren't evil, but if it fails, we still get change by showing that the country has fundamental issues that need to be resolved. A caterpillar cannot become a butterfly without the struggle of getting out of the cocoon first. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech, Opposition Whip. Calling on Opposition reply. Here.
Hello, am I audible now? Hello?
Yep, you're on.
Sorry. Okay. Just give me a few seconds to arrange my notes and timeline. No, am I still audible? For the tabs, this is Devlin for opposition reply.
Yep, you're still audible and noted.
Starting my speech. This is a debate about an actor who has to choose how they protect their goals and supporters. It's a choice of image. Do you want indigenous queers to be the forefront of the movement, or do you want to continue to present and benefit the very values you've spent your whole life protecting? Let's look at burden fulfillment. Government says we need uniqueness as a selling point, but these posits unanswered questions. First, are all tourists in these countries visiting for indigenous culture, or is it more likely that they're on vacation? Secondly, is presenting queerness as profitable the proximate priority as of the moment for these movements? Or thirdly, is tourism and indigenous queerness the type of representation that majority of queers actually want? Or fourthly, is tourism the best arbiter of queer rights? These are basic questions that government fails to answer. So they fall on technicality, burden fulfillment, and rigor of analysis. This also highlights that government is operating more like a travel agency and less than a queer movement. On opposition, we prove the following. First, that the goals of the LGBT movement is more maximized by retaining your principles. Second, the quality of the representation you receive is better when it's relatable for both local members and tourists. Third, insofar as indigenous people have asymmetrical power dynamics, the forced tourism is an act of exploitation because they never chose it, as opposed to the comparative of conventional queers who did choose it and proudly display it. This elevates the quality of the debate and elevates opposition's position over government for four reasons. One, the mechanisms are more proven and tend to greater likelihoods for the benefits to accrue. Two, the alignment with the incentives of the very actor in an actor motion, which Gov fails to prove. Three, the proximate protection of the vulnerable member queers that these movements are already beholden to because that's their job. And fourthly, the trickle-down benefit that indigenous queers enjoy regardless because they're still part of the movement. We just question why they shouldn't be the forefront just for exploitation. This already widens the margin and proves the win for opposition. But let's move further and dissect government's responses. The thing that they repeat ad nauseum is that they say that opposition contradicts because we tear down tourism but also enjoy the benefits from it at the same time. This is a straw man, and check your notes. The difference is clear on the quality of agency and representation is different for conventional queers and indigenous queers. When we tell you about power dynamics, the capacity, the history of these movements, the responsibilities of these movements, and where you're more likely to reconcile both local and international needs. This response from government cannot credit, and thus majority of opposition still stands. But I want to note, let's take government at their best and say that uniqueness is necessary. Let's measure then the extent of impact independent from mechanism. In terms of scale, sure, you get tourists that want to adventure and that want to look for culture, but these are probably historians or explorers. Not majority of tourists are like that. But in terms of scale on opposition, you get both local and international support from your own place and your own time. The second one is on incentive, because when you look at the incentive of the very actor we're fighting for, I don't understand why the incentive of indigenous queer that pops up out of nowhere stands to be the more proximate incentive as opposed to the very principles you've already been fighting for the entire time. But thirdly, on the extent on familiarity, because the thing that opposition tries to posit on this is that it's able to co-opt not only the uniqueness that posits specific tourists, but also the majority of the type of tourists that come, such as vacationers or just queer travelers, etc., etc. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech opposition reply and calling on government reply to end the debate.
Am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Three, two. Them dogs, bro. Yeah. 3, 2. One, if you want to believe opposition in their case about principles and how the movement represents itself, you have to believe that queer tourism is the only thing that the movement does. Because what we posit coming from PM is that queer tourism is an inherently niche thing because it's not the main concern of the movement. Therefore, the most important thing for you is not that you forward your own agendas within the type of queer tourism that you do, but rather that you create an experience that people are not able to experience in other places, precisely because the criteria of what makes a good queer tourism, as referred to in the info slide to begin with, is when you're able to provide a unique cultural and social experience to the queer travelers that you're able to gain from others, from like on sides. So that's just how I deal with the whole backloaded principle argument that comes from opposition. I think it's useless because like, how significant is queer tourism in this battle? Like, you just have to question. Like, it doesn't make sense that the way that you fight this battle is through queer tourism. Like, bro, there's other better ways to do that. It's not in here. Like, this is just not the battle that you want to fight. The second thing that I note is that a lot of the analysis that comes from opposition is heavily built on whip. You cannot credit like 80% of the whip speech precisely because it's new matter. Like that thing about power dynamics, for example, is new matter, is new argument, is something that only comes from opposition whip, not something that they deal with in their first two constructive speakers, penalize them on that. They don't like build anything meaningful that comes from their constructives. Next, I want to clarify that the goal on government has never been to maximize tourists. This is something that directly came from LO. They said they want to get as much foreign tourists as possible. So if you want to believe exploitation, I would argue that's just worse on their side, because they literally focus on the profits of it. Note, they shifted towards the principles thing, towards the latter end of their bench, for example. This is a clear contradiction, precisely because the two things cannot coexist, that you want to maximize your profit, but also you want to protect the principles that you have, for example. But they don't also prove why it's inherent to the motion that we're debating specifically, because what we proved to you earlier already is that this is not a concern outside of the queer tourism that you forward. I want to quickly respond to the expectation then, because LO was very trigger happy to argue that you get more tourism on their side. So you have to believe LO first, precisely because of rules of debate, for example, where you have to like believe everything that comes from LO, and anything that's contradictory from the bottom half should not be credited. Because the mech to this is that tourism is profiteering, because they subject it to create an experience. Note, they will still have to especially do this still then, because they still have, especially if you believe that their goal is to gain more tourists. So if the way that you if the way that you mitigate that on op is to say that the movement is good and they likely want to represent genuine experiences, you will have to believe that exists on government as well, precisely because you have to believe that the LGBTQ movement is in this for the good, is in this to like want to put the genuine things out there. That's just how I dismantle the whole argumentation, especially because this call out comes from WHIP. This is new matter. Note, op does not engage then to how you're able to provide the good tourism, which I would argue is the most important value. Because bro, it gaff if people don't go here for the queer tourism that we have because it's too niche. Precisely because the important thing that you have right now, and the most important thing that you should accomplish, is for you to be able to create that unique experience that is inaccessible anywhere else. They say Marina Summers, for example. They say like the contemporary art in UPD, for example. What we posited earlier is that often people are able to access this from like remote places. They can watch Marina Summers online. They can view art exhibits online, for example. The people that created these types of arts are literally still alive. So it's not enough of a tipping point for people to go here anyway. So if their benefit is hinged on the tourism working, what we prove to you, and something that they don't deal with, is that people do not go here. You cannot reap a lot of the opposition benefits precisely because they do not prove why the strategy is going to work, which is contingent to the benefits, because all of their benefits are like, oh, visibility, oh, like messaging to the people, that literally only something that works if you're able to make this fly. But more importantly, this is not the main battle. This is why you have to believe that the tourism and the quality is the most important thing.
Thank you very much for that speech, government reply, and thank you everyone for the wonderful round. Please cut the house and do give me 15 minutes for the oral education. Thanks.